The Lions have been plagued with injuries in 2024, unlike any other team in football. With 18 players on injury reserve and 13 defensive starters missing time this season, the Lions have been shorthanded for many weeks. And even outside of that injury reserve, the Lions last week missed six starters within the trenches that could have been the difference in Green Bay. The Lions have missed guys like Aiden Hutchinson, have missed guys like Marcus Davenport, Alex Anzalone, Derek Barnes, and over a dozen others have been placed on injury reserve and by week 18 will have missed a majority of the season. However, with the Detroit Lions getting into the backstretch of their NFL season with 4 games remaining versus the Bills, the Bears, the 49ers, and the Vikings, the Lions have a chance to get healthy as they gear up for a playoff run and they try to retool for a deep playoff success. The Lions are going to get back a number of players, including the 6 players that missed last week's game versus the Packers, including a number of players from that injury reserve list. And today, we're going to take a look at the players potentially returning from injury this week, as well as the timeline for those injury reserve players to rejoin the 53-man roster. Starting off with the players that are questionable going into this weekend versus Buffalo, there are quite a few impactful ones. Taylor Decker, the starting offensive tackle, has missed the last 2 games with a knee injury and has really been unavailable over the last couple of weeks. He's been quite good throughout the season and has been fantastic throughout his career. The Lions' offensive line is, of course, better when Taylor Decker is available, but he's been in and out of the lineup this year. He's suffered through a couple of different injuries over the last couple of seasons, but it does seem like there is a lot more positive news going into this week as opposed to the previous 2 in terms of Taylor Decker being available. Levi Onwuzurike, the rotational pass rusher, is suffering with a hamstring injury at the moment. He's missed the last 2 games as well. He's been a really good, solid rotational pass rusher for the Lions. And while he's not a superstar, he is better than what the Detroit Lions fielded last week against Green Bay. And returning him could add some much needed depth as well as some talent to a very, very depleted defensive line. Aleem McNeil, the Detroit Lions star, suffered a concussion on Thursday Night Football versus the Packers. He is projected to return as well, and we'll talk about his situation a little bit later. Josh Paschal, one of the best edge setters and one of the best run defending defensive linemen in the league, has missed the last 2 games with a knee injury, and he unfortunately is not guaranteed to return yet either. And then DJ Reader, who missed Thursday Night Football with a groin injury, is projected to return as well and could add again some much needed depth and some very, very much needed talent in the Detroit Lions defensive tackle room. Although Pat O'Connor did play very well on Thursday night, the depth behind him was pretty lackluster. Taking a look at the injury reserve, the Lions list is as long as anybody's. With Alex Anzalone, Khalif Raymond, Derek Barnes, Jalen Reeves-Maybin, John Kaminsky, and Aiden Hutchinson all on injury reserve, the Lions are missing a lot of star power. Of course, Aiden Hutchinson is their star pass rusher, probably was on pace to win Defensive Player of the Year. Alex Anzalone, the defensive captain. Derek Barnes, one of the defensive leaders. Jalen Reeves-Maybin, the special teams all-pro from a season ago. Lots of talent the Detroit Lions are missing out on, and tons of players that the Detroit Lions could expect to see back at some point in December or in January. But before we get to those players and their timeline for return, let's take a look a little bit more in depth of the 5 players that could return this week. Taylor Decker, as I mentioned, has missed 2 of the last couple of games. On the season, he's played 611 snaps, allowed 6 sacks, and 3 penalties. By far, one of his worst seasons as a pro, and yet still, the Detroit Lions would be lucky to have him back. Throughout his career, has been an above-average offensive tackle. He's been a player that improves the Detroit Lions' rushing attack, is a great leader, is a captain, and is one of the better offensive linemen the Lions have. The numbers, as I said, are a little bit down this year for Taylor Decker. He's allowed more sacks than in the past. He's not played as many snaps, but he is still a very good tackle, easily still a top 20 tackle in the NFL. And pairing that with Penei Sewell and bringing that back to an offensive line is going to do nothing but help the Lions in the trenches. When asked about it this week, Dan Campbell says that he feels a lot better about Taylor Decker returning as opposed to what he did for Thursday night and before. And even though it's not a guarantee, I do think there is a good likely shot that Taylor Decker does play this weekend versus Buffalo. Levi Onwuzurike is a little bit of a different story. The rotational pass rushers played 12 games for the Lions this season with 19 tackles, as well as a career high in sacks, quarterback hits, and forced fumbles. When asked about Levi Onwuzurike, Dan Campbell was a little less positive, but still open to the opportunity, saying there's certainly a chance that Levi could be back, but didn't seem nearly as positive or encouraged by the question as he did with Taylor Decker. Looking at Aleem McNeil, the Detroit Lions star, in 13 games this season, Aleem McNeil has 3.5 sacks, 7 TFLs, and 7 quarterback hits. He has a very unique situation with the concussion protocol. Obviously, each concussion is graded by a different level of severity. So, if it was a really bad concussion, there's a chance that he does miss a couple of weeks. But it does seem by the comments of Dan Campbell that he's getting really good results on his testing back, and that as long as there is no setback, he does expect Aleem McNeil to be available on Sunday and be a part of that defensive line rotation. Josh Paschal is very similar with 10 games under his belt this season, 19 tackles, 5 TFLs, and 2 sacks. Dan Campbell says that there's a better shot that Paschal plays than Levi Onwuzurike, but also said that it's probably about a 50-50 shot. Josh Paschal still kind of recovering from the knee injury that he suffered, and unfortunately could miss another week in Buffalo, but that would make him very likely to return in the divisional matchup as the Detroit Lions travel to Chicago and Soldier Field next week. In the elements, in a cold environment where Chicago is going to likely look to run the ball, that is a situation where the Detroit Lions need Josh Paschal a lot more, as opposed to an AFC matchup at home versus the Buffalo Bills. I think Josh Paschal is going to be more valuable in Chicago, so they could keep him out even more as a precaution to make sure that he's truly ready to go in Chicago. Taking a look at the injury reserve players, each and every one of those players we talked about has a path to return. Now, the Lions, as of right now, can only return 5 players in the regular season and 2 more throughout the playoffs. So, with that being said, this entire list could potentially return, but if another player is to get injured, the Lions are going to have to start making some decisions on what players are shut down for the season. Alex Anzalone broke his forearm against the Jacksonville Jaguars. It was a 6 to 8 week injury, which places his time for return potentially by week 16 to 18. However, if the Detroit Lions have locked up the division, have locked up the 1 seed by that time, and don't really have much more to gain, there's certainly a possibility that they activate him but don't play him, or start his 21-day window but do not have him return until the wild card or divisional round. Ifeatu Melifonwu was activated from injury reserve a few weeks ago, was on the active roster for about 24 hours, and then placed back on injury reserve with a broken finger. He is again eligible to return in week 16, and he is a great player for the Lions secondary, was great for the Lions a season ago as their third safety, and I think would allow the Lions to do a lot more in the secondary, but again, his return is yet to be determined. It's a finger, so it shouldn't be too long-term, but with Ifeatu Melifonwu, unfortunately, you never know. Ennis Rakestraw is also eligible to return in week 16. He has missed, obviously, the last couple of games and could add some much-needed cornerback depth if Emmanuel Mosley continues to be unavailable and the other 2 starters in Terrion Arnold and Carlton Davis continue to struggle with injury. His depth could bring a lot of presence as far as just having some depth and having some talent in the secondary. Khalif Raymond is eligible to return in week 17. The punt returner was having a career year, doing really well on the offense, being a great contributor on special teams, and unfortunately suffering that injury in Indianapolis. He is a player that the Lions could very much like to have back by the playoff time, right? Special teams, a massive part of what the Detroit Lions do, and having their top-tier Pro Bowl caliber punt returner would help them a ton, as well as, of course, adding some depth at wide receiver. Derek Barnes is kind of a long shot to return. He was a pretty major injury in the early parts of the season, suffered an MCL and a PCL tear back in week 3. And although it is unlikely that he returns for the Detroit Lions, talking to him in November, he didn't necessarily rule out the possibility of returning for the playoffs, right? Much like Aiden Hutchinson, there's a chance that come maybe the NFC Championship game or even the Super Bowl, the Detroit Lions could return their leader and heartblood on the defense. Derek Barnes was a great leader, brought a lot of intensity for the first couple of weeks, and had the Detroit Lions defense playing really, really well. And unfortunately, his injury was one of many within the linebacking group. And although his is the most unlikely of the bunch, it is not zero, and he should not be counted out from a potential return to Detroit. John Kaminsky is a player that tore his ACL in training camp and is a player that never saw the field for the Lions this year. A glue guy, dirty work type of player for the Lions who takes on double teams, eats up blocks, and opens up opportunity for others. John Kaminsky is a very selfless player for the Lions as a defensive lineman and overall would be a great addition, right? Adding him to the pass rush into the defensive line, going into the playoffs with Zadarius Smith, Josh Pascal, Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader, John Kaminsky, Al Kade Muhammad, as well as a couple of other players. That would add some much needed depth. It would add some much needed talent and potentially help the Lions pass rush quite a bit as they go into the playoff matchups and where teams run the ball, are super physical, and are just generally more talented than what the Detroit Lions have seen over the last couple of weeks. And then, of course, there is Aiden Hutchinson, whose return went from a potential Super Bowl return in February to a potential NFC Conference Championship return. By the time the playoffs roll around, it might be a divisional round return at this point. It is uncertain if he will return at all this season. Of course, the Lions would have to win a number of playoff games before that is to happen. But it seems more and more likely by the day that Aiden Hutchinson, if the Lions are to make it that far, could potentially return even in a limited capacity and help the Detroit Lions reach their ultimate goals. So that is kind of an update on the injury reserve players. A couple of players could return within the final weeks of the regular season, but expect a big push towards the playoffs, much like they did last year, activating guys like James Houston, CJ Gardner Johnson, and a couple of other players towards that timeline. Expect quite a few players in the weeks leading up to the wild card round, and less so in the final weeks of the regular season. For the Bills game this weekend, I expect Taylor Decker and Aleem McNeil both to play. I think DJ Reader is quite likely to play this week, but I do think that Josh Pascal and Levi Onwuzurike are less so. With the Detroit Lions having an AFC matchup, a matchup that honestly doesn't affect them too much. A loss would put them within half a game of the division and potentially a game under Philadelphia for the 1 seed. I don't think losing this game is necessarily the worst thing that can happen for the Detroit Lions. If they were to lose this game, and of course, if Minnesota and Philadelphia and Green Bay all win again, the Detroit Lions are still the 2 seed. The Detroit Lions are still first place in the conference. And with 3 games remaining, 2 of which are versus division rivals, the Detroit Lions still have the opportunity to close things out, win the division, and of course, take the 1 seed. And that, of course, assumes that Philadelphia wins. That assumes that Green Bay wins. That assumes that Minnesota wins to even make the race that tight. So a Bills loss could be obviously less than ideal, but isn't a backbreaker for this team, which is why I could potentially see the Lions leaving Pascal and Levi Onwuzurike for a week later, again, going to Soldier Field, playing that all much more important divisional matchup in which the Lions probably need to win that game if they are to lose against Buffalo. But with that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Just a quick injury update on the players that are questionable for this week, as well as the timeline for return of injury reserve players. There's a lot of talent coming back to the Lions, and they're going to be quite a scary playoff team come that time. But with that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below your opinions on each of these players, when they should return, and what you expect from them. But with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.